I'll begin this afternoon session with a brief introduction. Welcome to the Canadian Institute of Forestry's National Electronic Lecture Program. My name is Sharon Young, and I will be hosting today's session. Today is Thursday, November 20th, 2025, and this is the last session in the e-lecture series entitled Urban Expansion and Urban Forests Under Pressure, involving priorities and pathways. The series is brought to you by Tree Canada. The CIF-IFC is very pleased to collaborate with Dr. Gina Bardakjian and the team at Tree Canada to host these webinars. Today's webinar is titled From Pressure to Possibility, Integrating Science and Practice in Urban Forest Planning. A special reminder that the ISA certified arborists are eligible to receive one continuing education unit for this webinar. Please email electures@cififc.org with your full name and the ISA certified ID in order to obtain the ISA continuing education unit. Once we verify your attendance, we will send your information to ISA for them to process. Today we have Kaylee Taylor, Coordinator of Research and Engagement from Tree Canada, to introduce today's e-lecture speakers. Kaylee, over to you.
Afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for already our final e-lecture session in this series. On behalf of Tree Canada, I'm so pleased we are so pleased to be bringing together forest professionals to explore emerging research and strategies for supporting urban forests in the context of urban growth, and with a focus today on integrating science and practice in urban forest planning. I'm really looking forward to what we dive into today. As always, I want to thank Sharon for her coordination and to the Canadian Institute of Forestry for their continued partnership on these e-lecture series. And I have the pleasure of introducing our two speakers today, Dr. Melissa McHale and Amelia Needoba. Melissa leads the Urban Ecology and Sustainability Lab at UBC, advancing science for climate-resilient, nature-rich cities. Her work bridges research and municipal practice to guide urban forestry under pressures of densification, climate stress, and water scarcity. She is a 2025 recipient of the prestigious Peter Wall Legacy Award. Amelia is a principal and senior urban forester with Diamond Head Consulting, bringing over 20 years of experience in urban forestry across Canada, the US, and Australia. A project management professional and ISI certified arborist, she has led award-winning urban forest strategies, bylaws, and technical plans for more than 30 municipalities. I'm really looking forward to learning with all of you today. Please go ahead, guys.
Thanks, Kaylee and Sharon, and thanks to Tree Canada and the Canadian Institute of Forestry for inviting us to talk today. And thank you all for tuning in to listen. Melissa and I, as you heard, are going to speak about integrating science and practice in urban forest planning. And really under this theme of, how we can move from sort of pressure towards possibility in addressing a lot of the problems that cities face in terms of advancing urban forestry. At a very high level, we've sort of framed this problem as being the fact that cities are really asking urban forestry to do more to, really address resilience and really perform and produce benefits. But they're asking for that outcome to happen in a context where we're frequently dealing with less space, where urban forests are facing a lot more threats. And a lot of our frameworks are often inflexible to sort of really tackling these problems. And so that's going to be the focus of our talk today, how we can identify some of those possibilities and pathways towards overcoming some of these challenges. And so digging into some of the pressures a little bit more, cities have always been pretty tough environments for trees to grow in, but the pressures are really intensifying. So from a climate perspective, we're facing, rising temperatures, longer dry periods, new pests and diseases arriving, and more frequent and damaging extreme events that are really pushing the limits of many of the native and urban tree species that grow in cities. And at the same time, urban forests are being asked to play a really key role in climate adaptation and to be healthy and produce those benefits that we're looking for. In a lot of different provinces in Canada, housing legislation has been also coming in to accelerate densification and more development, often impacting, established neighbourhoods and greenfield areas that typically were home to lots of urban forest residents. And that push for more housing is reshaping the urban form, and we're seeing, larger building footprints on smaller lots, reduced setbacks, and more utility connections and more types of utilities. And all of that is leaving little room for soil and for space for trees in the landscape. We also see issues where there's a lot of pressure for faster development and reducing the costs of building. And so that's really creating some direct trade-offs between housing delivery and plantable space in cities. And we're also seeing that these pressures are playing out in systems that are often fragmented in different ways. So, for example, physically in the form of gentle density and the push for multiplex housing, that outcome is really dividing the space physically in terms of what was pretty contiguous plantable landscapes into little pockets of landscapes with little space for trees to grow. We also have institutional silos that lead to sort of setting up competing priorities, where we've got the push from planning to drive density and speed up permitting. We've got demands from engineering to meet standards for safety and servicing and deliver those efficiently. And then we end up in situations where parks or urban forestry are sort of managing or dealing with the space that remains and the trees that get put into those spaces. So the gaps there in terms of policy and the silos between departments can make it really hard to resolve some of the conflicts between this drive for densification and canopy expansion. But what do we really want from our urban forests? We hear time and time again from the cities that we work with that the community wants greener, cooler, healthier communities. And that expectation is really driving demand for urban forestry. And there's both social and environmental reasons to expand canopy and to restore nature in cities and improve livability overall. But turning those expectations into on-the-ground results is a really big challenge. And so this diagram is, a pretty typical sort of benefit diagram, but what it's representing is really the types of outcomes that we as urban foresters are trying to manage for in cities, such as cooler streets, having access to nature nearby, improving stormwater interception, and being able to have functioning ecosystems and habitats near urban areas. But in order to deliver benefits, we need trees to be healthy and long-lived, often large canopy trees. This diagram represents a sort of life cycle representation of an individual tree, and the fact that the costs of installing an urban tree and maintaining it, they're really high at the beginning of the tree's life, and then they kind of drop, and then they're high again at the end of the tree's life when we have to deal with removal and replacement. And we can see at the same time, the benefits aren't realized right away. When you install a tree, you need to wait for it to reach maturity before you're really maximizing those benefits. And that's quite different from other types of infrastructure, such as a streetlight. You install it, it's instantly delivering the thing that you expected. But for trees, we have to foster the environment for them to be able to grow and reach that stage in their life cycle. So young trees cost a lot to establish, and they don't provide a lot of benefit at the beginning. So if they die early or they start declining, at a young age, then the city's paying for that cost without realizing that long-term benefit. And so given that mature trees are the ones that deliver the benefits we're managing for, we really need to be able to keep trees in this stage for as long as possible. And doing that requires appropriate growing environments for trees. But you can't always get what you want. And in cities, trees are growing in increasingly difficult environments. So even with a strong ambition and political support, driving changes that will achieve good outcomes for trees often runs into barriers. And those can be systemic barriers or attitudinal barriers. Sometimes trees are viewed as being, high maintenance or risky or resource intensive. And those types of assumptions can influence the outcomes that occur on the ground. So perceptions can make it more difficult to integrate trees into engineering and planning frameworks that are really sort of built more for the control and certainty of the outcomes that they're seeking in terms of the cost and the results. Often the issues that are experienced with trees in urban environments, are not necessarily the individual tree or the species, but more about how poorly planting sites are designed and constructed and really sort of set up a situation for conflicts to arise. We also see this often happen in sort of, project budgets, that you might have a great design that includes trees and includes soil, but costs go up and budgets tighten, and it's the soil and the trees that end up being the first line items to get cut. And so these kinds of issues result in the outcomes that are sort of shown in this image here on the right, where trees are often placed in conditions that limit their ability to reach maturity and to deliver the benefits that the communities are expecting. But at the same time, this is also where we need to look for possibilities. So the barriers in cities are not fixed, things change over time, and all of the challenges that I just spoke about on the previous slide do have ways to overcome them, pathways forward. And so what cities get really in the end depends a lot on the vision that they set, and then on how intentionally they integrate trees into planning, into engineering, and into development processes. And so in this section of turning possibility into practice, I'm first going to cover some of the policy approaches that we've explored to improve the possibilities for trees. And then Melissa's going to talk about how the policy can come together with the data and design to sort of improve our practices in the future. And I guess just to set the stage from our perspective as consultants, for a number of years, we noticed that municipalities would keep coming to us and ask us to look at their tree bylaw to address their concerns about losing too many trees, about not seeing canopy cover replaced. But it became really clear to us that most of the constraints and the results, the outcomes that cities were seeing, were more related to the land use rules, things like zoning and servicing standards, and then the way that development sites were being designed and shaped and prepared sort of long before trees were introduced or addressed in the landscape. And so a tree bylaw can regulate the removal and replacement of individual trees, but it can't create space for trees where zoning eliminates it, and it can't protect roots or provide soil volume when engineering standards require compacted subgrades and shallow soil for landscaping. It also can't prevent development patterns that only leave a small amount of space or leftover areas for planting. And so these screenshots here sort of illustrate that difference where, on the left-hand side, we have these older established neighborhoods, more typical of historic single-family development, where we had pretty big lots, pretty deep setbacks relative to the size of the building on the lot. And that left large areas that were naturally able to support bigger, healthier trees. There was plenty of space. And so we didn't really need to regulate it. Whereas in these newer neighborhoods on the right, what we're seeing is, smaller lot sizes, maximal building footprint, and really it's, prioritizing the building and the size of those buildings for single family units over having any landscape left. And so the space for trees isn't being designed into land uses like this, and the tree bylaw really can't have any influence over that. This image shows, an alternative way of achieving density while still accommodating landscape and space for large canopy trees. And while this form of development isn't going to be what's desired in every community in all cases, the point really is that it's the land use regulations that need to shape the sites so that there's space for trees if canopy cover is going to be part of our future neighbourhoods. So with that in mind, we developed the Metro Vancouver Tree Regulations Toolkit. The region was seeking to have guidance for municipalities that was going to be able to give them what they needed to develop regulations that would protect and enhance their tree canopy. And so that was really an opportunity to not just look at tree bylaws, but look at the broader land use and servicing regulations that determine whether trees can succeed. And so the toolkit attempts to bring those pieces together and give municipalities guidance on how they can integrate trees into regulations more holistically. So this is a BC context, but in most provinces have a relatively sort of similar legislative frameworks and multiple levels of policy that influence tree outcomes. So in BC, and the way that the toolkit is structured, at the top we have high-level tools like official community plans and urban forest management strategies that really set the vision and the long-term goals for canopy in a city. They also set the vision, the OCP sets the vision for development, sustainability and livability, and really tells us what the city is trying to achieve. And then at the next level down, we have these tools that regulate land use, things like zoning and subdivision bylaws. And these are really critical because they shape the form of development, as you could see before, and they determine whether there's going to be physical space for trees before we even consider regulating trees themselves. And then finally, we have tools that regulate urban nature directly. In BC, those are things like development permit areas and tree bylaws. And they really operate at the individual site scale and guide how trees are protected, how they're replaced or planted, and then managed through the development process. So canopy outcomes really depend on all of these levels working together. A strong tree bylaw can help, of course, but it's only going to succeed if the higher level vision and the land use frameworks create the guidance and the space for trees to grow in the landscape. And so I'll dig into those a little more and just provide some examples. Really, the official community plans and forest strategies set that big picture. They establish the long-term visions, the citywide goals, and they really signal how much of a priority trees are in a community. And that OCP is also critically important in shaping that long-term land use vision. And that will also, shape how what we can achieve in terms of our urban forest outcomes across different land uses. They also help align different city departments in achieving that same vision. And that can be really supportive of urban forestry or not, depending on what it says in that policy. Land use tools, as I said, are really critically important to impacting the space available for trees and determining how much of a site can be covered with buildings, with pavement and parking, and what's left for planting. And so these illustrations sort of show, how different rules in zoning can be influential. So site coverage by itself can preclude trees if most of the lot becomes hard surface. Even if there is some pervious space, if we just sort of have it around the fringes, then the design may not support any tree planting at all. This next illustration shows how we can play with the building massing to consolidate a space and make a space available for a planting area to potentially accommodate a tree. In many cases, we can still accommodate the same amount, of floor area in a building on a site, but configure it a bit differently to support tree planting as well. Setbacks are another really important tool in zoning that can create space. So in this example, the building's shifted to the back and really maximised all the pervious area in the front and created a larger area for landscaping. And then those setbacks can also be sort of aligned with neighbouring properties with public realm frontages to expand the area of plantable space. Another very influential outcome is surface parking. And we find parking requirements often have a pretty big impact because surface parking tends to occupy the same space that would otherwise be occupied by trees and landscaping. So sometimes in some cities we can reduce parking requirements and that can free up space as well. But we also have to keep in mind what's happening underground at the same time. In many cases, we've got utility connections or underground parking structures that can eliminate planting spaces, even if it looks like there should be space. So these are all things we have to keep in mind as we're developing these tools. And so just to summarize, these are some of the elements of zoning that we find very influential in terms of canopy cover outcomes. Not all configurations are equal. Land use tools really need to influence where that pervious space is going to end up to actually support trees. And all of those elements in a zoning bylaw can work together to create those spaces and influence how the spaces are shaped, but also to guide the quality and the configuration of the landscape that results. And so where zoning regulates the use and the form of what can be built, the development servicing rules then govern the infrastructure that supports that development. Things like the streetscape, the drainage, the utilities, and the engineering requirements in general for both that private realm, but then also the public realm and streetscape frontage as well. And so the servicing standards can have a really big influence on planting conditions, and especially for street trees. So even if our zoning rules are preserving pervious area, we can still find that servicing can fragment that space with utilities, with driveways or insufficient soil for the landscaping that's put in. But we can also flip that and acknowledge that development servicing can work not just for hard infrastructure, but it can also be used to support better growing environments for trees. So it's another really important tool to consider alongside the zoning. And then when it comes to tools that regulate trees themselves, tree bylaws are still really important for regulating tree retention and ensuring canopy is replaced when it is removed. But their effectiveness is limited by the physical space that other bylaws create. And this graphic on the right here is really just illustrating that, the bigger the tree, the more space it needs to either be retained or to grow. So small trees we can put into narrow setbacks, but medium and large trees, they really need, 3, 5 or more meters separation from the structure, from the excavation in order to be retained or planted. And so without that space, both retention and replacement become really difficult regardless of what a tree bylaw requires. So just to hammer that message home, tree bylaws are helpful tools, but they only work as well as the land use regulations that support them. And then thinking forward, we're densifying our cities. We're not always going to be able to plant a conventional, take the conventional approach of planting a tree in the ground. And this is where we think performance-based standards could really come into play. Sometimes cities are going to need flexibility in how greening is going to be achieved, especially on complex sites or development forms like podium buildings or zero lot line housing. We can't expect those developments to always provide the soil depth or the volume needed to support that large, long-lived tree. In those situations, requiring a large canopy tree doesn't work, but we shouldn't have the alternative as nothing at all. So these performance-based models, like the examples here, the Seattle Green Factor and the Toronto Green Standard, they provide examples where a system, instead of prescribing a specific planting solution or tree per lot, they set up a performance target for greening that really then allows multiple different ways to meet it. So for example, it could be met with a high quality soil zone for planting, or it could be to do with stormwater integration into a landscape, or green roofs or green walls, or other interventions that are also supporting outcomes that cities need, whether or not trees are the only able to be achieved on that site as well. They also often are built in with incentive approaches. So if you achieve an outcome that's above and beyond the standard required, there are sometimes incentives like expedited permitting or fee reductions. And so those can feed into sort of positive feedback loops of improved greening. And these types of approaches give cities more flexibility to improve overall greening outcomes, even when sites can't support a tree. And so, in the face of these options, how do we go about choosing the right tool? So the Tree Regulations Toolkit has taken an approach of mapping out how various tools could work together to sort of form a menu of options that municipalities can use with the goal of influencing canopy cover outcomes. In general, municipalities have a range of regulatory tools available to them, and each one sort of shapes a different part of the environment that trees rely on. And the challenge is often knowing which tools are going to make a meaningful difference in a given community. And the answer will not be the same everywhere. So we really framed it in a way of suggesting that choosing that right approach depends a lot on your local context, on the biophysical conditions, the political landscape, the institutional and legislative frameworks, and then, of course, the people and the coalitions who influence the decisions that are made in cities. So we can try, as urban forest planners, we can try to account for those factors and make informed choices. But often we find we lack strong evidence about which levers are really improving canopy outcomes and delivering the benefits that communities are looking for. And so that gap sometimes makes it hard for cities to choose confidently or for us to convey, the benefit of the outcomes that they could achieve with these changes. And so that's what really led us to begin in collaboration with Melissa's lab at UBC. Our work sort of first overlapped in the city of Kelowna, where we completed the urban forest strategy, and then they involved the urban ecology and sustainability lab, working on some of the questions around how to implement that strategy. And so Melissa's research on data-driven decision-making is really going to complement, the policy and regulatory lens of that city and other cities, and help us understand what's working, what isn't, and then where to focus our efforts in the future for the greatest impact. And so with that, I will hand the presentation over to Melissa and just stop my screen sharing.
Thank you, Amelia. Just give us a moment to switch over control of the presentation slides. Can you see my slides now?
We can.
Awesome. So like Amelia was saying, the Urban Ecology and Sustainability Lab has been working closely with Diamond Head Consulting and other city partners. These partnerships, we learn a lot about challenges facing urban forestry professionals and practitioners. Not only have our partners been inspiring to us to develop new methods for supporting decision-making in cities, but they also share access to amazing data sets, resources, tools, and that they help us advance the science of urban ecology overall. And what does a scientist love more than data? Not much. Or maybe that's just me. So over the years, while doing this community and partnership engaged science, it's become obvious to me how hard it is to develop effective practices and policies in cities. There are always trade-offs to consider. There are always different perspectives to balance. A good example of this is what I saw in the semi-arid cities of Colorado. In this location, trees do not necessarily grow naturally. This is a grassland ecosystem, and urbanization is putting intense pressure on already limited water resources. So on one hand, cities are promoting tree canopy and the benefits of trees to maintaining a healthy water balance, while water conservation managers can't help but see the sharp increase in water use associated with landscaping decisions during the summer months as a problem, and especially in drought years. So working closely with decision makers and leveraging a plethora of their data, we were able to analyze the landscaping and water trade-offs in Fort Collins. Some of the answers were not at all surprising. Sure, households with a higher income use more water. On the other hand, some of the results were surprising. For instance, water managers expected to clearly see that the urban forest was a drain on the water supply. Yet the data showed if you had mature trees in your landscape, that was not the case. You actually used less water than your neighbors. We also noticed that residents with smaller properties used more water. So all this development covering the foothills of the Rockies, which we lovingly call the Colorado Front Range, promoted densification, was having these unexpected impacts on water supply. We can talk about this more later, but the basics are logical. If you only have a small patch of grass, you don't feel like you're using that much water to keep it green. Plus, your neighbors are so close to you, and you're feeling some responsibility to manage your landscape in a really intense way. So these things lead to unexpected outcomes. Several years ago, I moved to Canada and began learning the context of British Columbia cities. I quickly became interested in the Okanagan Valley for obvious reasons, like skiing and grapevines, but mostly because this was a semi-arid region of the province that was on the cutting edge of climate change impacts. The hottest, driest, and most fire-prone areas of Canada are in this region, and they're experiencing intense urbanization at the same time. Diamond Head Consulting was busy working on Kelowna's sustainable urban forest strategy. Our early conversations with city managers were nuanced and stimulating. And after the SUFs was completed, we moved on to the next question. Now that we have canopy goals, can we actually meet them? We began to compile data sets and develop methods to figure out what the planting potential was across the city and in different neighborhood contexts. Specifically, what are the infrastructural constraints and other barriers that might keep us from meeting our canopy targets? And how will current and future transportation plans and development pressures impact tree planting into the future? Together, my lab and Diamond Head worked on developing high-resolution land cover data sets and models that would help us see spatially where trees of different sizes could fit in the heterogeneous landscape. Our model, called Canopy Fit, was developed to support an interactive and iterative process for understanding tree planting potential in the face of infrastructure barriers or different planning scenarios. The city of Kelowna was especially worried about being able to green the dense and already urbanized urban center. So that's where we began applying our methods. We're in the middle of our analyses and expect to have a completed version of these results for the city's review and for publication in the scientific literature, of course, in the next few months. But here's a first look at the kind of the results we're seeing. In the sustainable urban forest strategy, the city hoped to increase canopy cover from about 12 to 20% and plant about 11,500 trees. Our model, without addressing tree planting constraints and planting in every possible space, showed it's quite possible for the city of Kelowna to get close to meeting their goals. However, the more we contextualized the landscape and took into account barriers to tree planting, the more we were able to see how hard it was going to be for them to achieve their goals without some changes to practice, policy, and land management. You know, the urban center area of the city is already densely populated, and it contains a lot of great infrastructure. But there are some parts of the city where the model shows it's possible to meet canopy targets. There's something else to consider, though, as always, and that is the space for planting and where it falls. Does it fall on private or public land? Our modeling exercises showed us just how dependent we might be on private spaces to achieve our greening goals across the city. And now we're only talking right now about that current landscape potential, but we also have to think about future development and infill. Kelowna has a model city platform that can predict reasonable accuracy where infill and development is going to occur over time. And so we're going to use those projections and also see how future development will impact our planting potential into the future. Another step, I know we have so many steps, right? But we're working on at the moment is analyzing how planting potential changes with the bylaws and policies across the city and within certain neighborhoods of interest as well. These kinds of projections can help us justify the policies with data, and it can also help us communicate to the public why changes in the bylaws or the policies would be beneficial to the future livability of the city. Kelowna keeps asking us, though, where should we prioritize tree planting now? And I know we all feel this urgent need to figure out what we should do first and justify our actions. But here we are in a place where we're finding that some of our tools aren't helping as much as we want them to. So our lab is now working on understanding why the tree equity score and other metrics like it are not as helpful as we'd like them to be in practice. We know that part of the problem is associated with data limitations and the resolution challenges with those data sets. However, we can address this through creating more thoughtful boundaries and working with a variety of data sets at once to determine what are the best indicators of vulnerability and equity in each city and in each neighborhood. At the same time, we can also develop new methods to determine where we can maximize the impact of trees on certain urban challenges, especially increasing urban heat. So this is our realm where we are thriving right now. And my students are using solar radiation modeling to show us where we can place trees to maximize their impacts across Kelowna. This ensures that we are maximizing the benefits of all tree canopy cover additions. Right now, we're also doing something else that I'm excited about. We want to know also where to plant trees, right? Where they can have the best chance of survival. Here you can see high resolution surface temperature maps that we've recently developed for the city. This is a zoom in, of course, to one particular landscape. Most places that are mapping urban heat across the landscape use very low resolution satellite data. That's that Landsat LST up there. And that doesn't capture the heterogeneity of the thermal dynamics in a city. We employed a method to downscale the Landsat surface temperature from a 30-meter resolution map to a 10-meter resolution map. When we look at this new higher resolution image in the context of different land covers, we can not only see which landscapes are hotter, but also which landscapes are watered. These factors are then linked to a data set on species that are either doing well in the city currently or are likely to do well in Kelowna in the future. That's another data set we developed for the city. And so when we link these things together, they can help the city decide which trees are right for which location and with climate change. Right now, there's a lot of mapping ecosystem services happening in the world. If it's not based on unverifiable and inaccurate models, most of it is a bird's eye view of a landscape and often conflates ecosystem structure, function, and services. Our lab does some of the work in this space as well, but it's only a starting place for us. We're interrogating these spatial representations to understand what they can tell us, but also where they're failing us, especially in the context of effectively supporting planning decisions. For instance, our research is showing just how important it is to understand how people are experiencing urban structure and function on the ground. Surface temperature maps, especially those created from a Landsat 30-meter resolution image, and most of them are inadequate representations of the thermal environment and how people experience the landscape. We employ new sensors to understand the biophysical variables that represent heat stress and thermal comfort in a relationship to humans on the ground, as well as our social science methods are helping us to understand how people are experiencing heat and what they find most thermally comfortable. Using these tools and methods together help to see that people report being more comfortable in landscapes they perceive to be aesthetically pleasing or safe. This means we have even more tools in our toolbox to increase people's quality of life and health and well-being. Besides the fact that people tend to find urban landscapes that have trees to be more pleasing, not surprisingly, and therefore we can move away from just the simple suggestion that all we need to do is provide shade. It does not matter what kind of shade to keep people cool. That is a fallacy that all of us tree people know isn't true. Now we can show it with data. Yay, us. So with this type of research at the hyperlocal scale, we've also been able to interrogate landscaping decisions and their trade-offs. Our research on the ground is showing canopy cover on parcels around buildings continues to have an impact on mean radiant temperature, which is an indicator of how people actually experience heat on the ground. Past the 30% canopy cover goal, which is often promoted as the magic amount of canopy all cities should strive to achieve, there's benefits way beyond that 30%. So in terms of thermal benefits, the more canopy you have, the more benefits you're going to receive. Should all places have more canopy cover? Not necessarily, but 30% is certainly not a magic metric of any value per se. Interestingly, in this study, we found that for every 10% increase in canopy cover, people experience a decrease in temperature of 1 degree Celsius. I think that's quite an impressive relationship in its own right. But that study was done in a particularly weird, wet, and cold and cloudy summer in Colorado. We did this work so the following year we followed up when it was a normal hot and dry summer. And we actually found a 2 degree change with every 10% increase in canopy cover, which is quite important for us to think about in our urban landscapes moving forward. So, on that note, I just want to leave you with one more thing. Diamond Head Consulting and our city partners are continually inspiring us to do better as scientists, to understand what questions we ask, how we ask those questions. It actually matters how we ask them. It matters to the usability of the results, how meaningful and impactful they are to the real world. I think this is one of the many reasons why we should embrace city, industry, academic relationships and partnerships. Not only can we advance science, we can advance the practice. So I want to leave you with this particularly inspiring example. As an urban ecologist, I've become frustrated with our obsession with just urban tree canopy only. Cities are complex and heterogeneous ecosystems, and trees are important, but just only one component of that ecosystem. As we begin to evaluate the trade-offs and different needs across our cities, we need to embrace that structure and function of the place and how people experience these landscapes. Diamond Head Consulting and the development of their urban forest strategies began a partnership with another group, Pipaquan Petaquan, who are experts in Indigenous engagement. Through engaging with local Indigenous people around Fort Saskatchewan, they showed how people value the 7 layers of the urban forest and how our planning needs to consider more than just the overstory. I felt like this was very inspiring, just this partnership. And so I think we do better when we work together. And at that point, I can stop screen sharing. We have a lot of people to thank, and some of them are in this image, not all of them. But we have awesome people working at both Diamond Head Consulting and in the Urban Ecology Lab at all different levels. And I couldn't do this work without them because, come on, do professors really do work?
I actually have one question. How can public participation contribute to maintaining and improving urban forest health?
Are we going to fight over who goes last on this one, Amelia?
Maybe. You want me to go first?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. It's a good question. I mean, we find public participation, there's many avenues into it in terms of supporting urban forestry in cities. And cities have really sort of diverse ways in which they have the public participate in urban forest management. Certainly from the planning perspective, having the public involved in helping shape the values and the goals and priorities for those plans is really beneficial. And we find as well, the public are really what provides some of the context around what's important from a place-based perspective in planning. And so if we can hear their stories about what they value and about what's important to them, it can really provide us with more of that place-based context that can help us develop a better plan. And then from an implementation perspective, I mean, the more active community participation is in terms of whether it's extending the capacity of the city to help people plant trees on private land or help educate or advocate for urban forestry. There's a ton of ways in which that public participation advances the performance of cities. And in a lot of cases, it is the public who have really helped to drive urban forest programs and really encourage that investment. Oh, Melissa, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I do. There's some other really interesting questions coming up as well, but I just want to bring I think a good example is some of the work that our students are doing in partnership with cities and communities on the ground. For instance, there's some graduate students in Lori Nesbitt Lab. She's one of my colleagues at UBC, and she runs the Urban Natures Lab. And we have a student doing photo voice methods. And so people are using cameras to express how they're experiencing the urban environment, and for different age groups. And we're seeing that like just people have different needs, right? And that's obvious, but sometimes there's things that we're not paying attention to in people's experience of heat that are important to our planning. So, because we can't put trees everywhere, nor should we. So for instance, the elderly community was telling us that on hot days, they really struggle to find places to sit, but also they worry about finding bathrooms, and so often leave the house without drinking much because they're worried they're gonna have to use a restroom at some point and they're not going to find one. And so this means that they leave the house dehydrated and also worried about having like safe places to rest in cool environments as they're trying to move across the city. And so both those things can help us think about where to put infrastructure with our green infrastructure, and also make it so all people can travel safely across the city. So I think a lot of the ways in which we have to implement the solutions is it's very fine scale thinking.
Thank you, Melissa and Amelia, for sharing your insights. So now we have some questions for you. There's one in the Q&A pod, and I will read it out. One constraint we have in tree planting is power lines. In Quebec, Hydro-Quebec offers recommended distances from the lines for each species, but they're often very, very general. Could be 10 to 15 meters away for large trees like oaks, which is very limiting in planting in backyards and such. What are your thoughts on how much leeway we can allow regarding these recommended distances?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Certainly, overhead lines are something that a lot of cities have to deal with in both the maintenance of their existing trees as well as for tree planting. And I agree, the distances and setbacks are, I think, often very conservative. And sometimes there is leeway, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes there's, the fire risk and the safety does have its limits. We have recently been working with some different hydro providers to sort of understand how we can, I guess, better achieve outcomes that cities have both for canopy goals and for electrical infrastructure. And I think, the problem maybe with the sort of setback guidance is, again, sometimes it's just a single answer for every situation, but in reality, there's more complexity and the results. There is sometimes more flexibility. That can be sometimes to do with the material that's used to construct power lines or the way the overhead lines are built. So there are sometimes ways to reduce the amount of setback that's required. But a lot of that nuance really does involve a relationship existing between, like for a city, for example, the urban forestry department and the electrical provider. They need to be able to work together through the design process to come up with solutions that will allow the coexistence if there isn't sufficient space to achieve those idealized setbacks. So while they probably won't reduce them in terms of their guidance, in reality, there are ways of working together to accommodate both in closer proximity.
Thank you, Amelia. Melissa, you want to add any points?
No, I think that's all,
Covers
Amelia.
everything.
Yeah.
Okay, there's one more question for you from the chat. So it's from Michael. He's wondering, I'm wondering how expensive this sort of data-driven exercise is. How much is the expertise available to do it?
I was just responding to that in the chat. I wasn't sure if you're going to be able to answer it. And And I was sarcastically saying that scientists are very, very expensive, so totally unaffordable. But it's actually not true. Our goal is to develop these methods so they can be implemented by other people easily. And so there is the cost of that science to be done. But once we develop it, it's easy for Diamond Head or other consulting firms to pick up and then implement it. And then we've been getting funding from external agencies to do that, right? So, for the city of Kelowna, they did have some funding after to implement their sustainable urban forest strategy. And then we've been leveraging that funding to do the work that they need to do, but also leveraging it to make more money for them. So we've been applying for alliance grants. We leveraged that partnership to get other funding from the university. There's partnership grants where you can employ funds to actually work together on these challenges. And so I think there's all kinds of strategies for funding this work. And then even on the industry side, there's the shred funding, and there's ways to support graduate students and their work. Undergrads and graduate students are relatively cheap and they love these experiences to help prepare them for their workforce. And so I think it's actually just a lot of benefits with little costs, but Amelia might feel differently.
Well, I guess it highlights the point that, yeah, for us to develop those methods, it is very expensive. It's hard for us to do it. And so these types of partnerships enable the research to happen and the methodologies to be developed. And then for us to apply them, it actually improves the outcomes, but doesn't increase the costs in general because there's a method for us to work with.
Thank you, Amelia and Melissa. I think that's all the questions we have for now. If there are no more questions, I'd like to close this session. Thank you all for participating in today's webinar. And once again, a big thank you to Melissa and Amelia for the great presentation. Bye, everyone.